Hello, my name is Matt Corral, and this video is an introduction to user story mapping for beginners. Now I'm doing this because I've been asked recently how I go about doing mapping in some of my projects, whether you're a UX designer or a service designer, what sort of techniques I might use. User story mapping is one of my favourite methods. It originates from the world of agile software development, particularly a guy called Jeff Patton, who's well worth looking up, who originally coined the term and set out some of the rules for how you do this. I like it a lot because it matches very well to the way that a lot of designers work anyway. We tend to describe user journeys, we tend to do journey maps, task maps, there are a lot of names for them, but we tend to get a bunch of post-its and put them in a horizontal row to kind of describe things that users do, steps in a journey or tasks they have when they're using the service or the product that we're designing. Now this matches really nicely with user story mapping, which is something that comes out of the world of software development. So if you're a designer, this is a very straightforward and visual way that you can describe things that users do, and it translates very nicely into something that developers you're working with will make sense of as well. So I'm going to describe the basic principles of a story map and how it's made up by using nothing more than black Sharpie pen and a few different coloured post-it notes. And in a minute I'll show you some of the digital tools that we use in my work to further these maps. But to explore the basic principles you need nothing more than a few different coloured post-it notes. 3 or 4 different colours will do it. And I'm going to start with a scenario we should all be familiar with, which is getting out of bed and getting to work in the morning. So to teach the principles, we're going to think through what are the steps we go through every morning in our routine when we get up and get ourselves to work. What do we have to do? The very first thing all of us probably do is wake up. So I'm going to write down on a post-it, I'm going to stick it as the first stage of my map. What do I do after that? Well, I might think, next thing I do in the morning is I go and get myself in the shower. So I'm going to write shower. I'm going to put that up as the next user story in the journey. After that, perhaps I go and have my breakfast, perhaps I get dressed. I might go and have my breakfast, so I'm going to put that up as the next thing. So these are the very highest level user story. They're a big thing that I might do, a significant chunk of activity, and we've written them down as what we tend to call the epics. The epics are the highest level of user story, the biggest thing. And within them, they can be smaller user stories. We can break it down even further. But we tend to start with a big picture, and going from left to right, you can imagine a user doing these things in sequence. Now, we can explode one of these and describe sub-steps within it, which are smaller user stories. So for example, let's analyse I wake up. Are there steps to that? Well, perhaps the first thing I have to do is switch off my alarm clock. So let's write that down first. And we place that in a different colour on a row beneath, so that we can see the story is inside that story. Perhaps the next thing I then have to do is get myself out of bed, so I'm going to write get out of bed. That's going to be my next user story. And all the time when I'm doing this, I'm considering the size of things. And I might have to adjust my map to make room for something, because I'm filling up with more stories here. I'm going to move my epics across. I think that about does it for me. So, the high level user story, the epic, is me waking up. Within that there are stories, sub-steps. I first have to switch on my alarm clock, get myself out of bed. What about showering? How can we break that down? Well, perhaps I first have to find myself a towel. So let's put that, find towel. Then I need to turn on the water. So let's turn on the water, let's write that down. Now in this case, it might be that the water's already at a temperature I'm comfortable with, because that's how I leave it. Or perhaps someone else in the family has been adjusting it and the water's not at the temperature I want. So another action I might have is to adjust the water temperature. So I'm going to write that down. The idea is to think through everything a user might do in as much detail as you possibly can and write it all down. Now, maps tend to change over time. You might learn more things about users and return to your map and add more detail. You might choose to move things around. The important thing is that you're thinking through from a user's point of view what happens, and you're trying to get everything visualized in one big map. Then you can see the entirety of the job and you're free to move things around, add things and change things as you see fit. So probably I've got to adjust the water temperature before I turn the water on, or do I? Do I have to turn it on first to see what temperature it's at? Yeah, I think they probably happen one after the other. So I'm going to find a towel, turn on the water and adjust the water temperature. That should be enough for you guys to get across the principles of this. We could break things down even further should we wish to, so let's have a think. Yeah, perhaps if I'm adjusting the water temperature, I could be turning it left or I could be turning it right, clockwise or anti-clockwise on the dial. Now you might write those down as an even smaller step, so turn clockwise, turn anti-clockwise. I'm going to move to a third post-it note, third level of detail, and I'm going to explode this story even further. Now, so far everything we've described runs from left to right because it's happening in a linear fashion. These are steps that users go through step by step. But sometimes you're going to come across points in this journey where a user might do one of two or three or more things. Where there are different options and different choices, we put them in parallel vertically. So in this case, my overall epic is I want to shower. The particular user story is adjusting the water temperature. And then I might want to turn the water temperature left or right. So I'm going to put those in parallel. Now, you're going to stop because I've deliberately done something that's a little bit off. I've described a solution here. I've assumed that there's a dial and I've described myself turning it to the left or to the right. Now, the key thing about writing user stories is we don't solutionize. We don't describe a feature or a component, a product. Instead, we have to always think about what it is the user is trying to do, and we have to write that in its place. Now, the reason we do that is so that we are free as designers to think about the best possible solution to achieve that goal. And so that we don't describe features or things without having a clear idea what their purpose is and what they do for people. So, silly me, I wrote turn the dial clockwise and turn it anti-clockwise. Actually, what someone's doing is raising or lowering the temperature of the water. So what I really should do is rewrite these to describe the user story. I want to raise the temperature or lower the temperature of the water. So I'm going to scribble that down now. Raise the temperature in one direction, lower the temperature in the other. When I do it this way, I've described two things that a user might do. I put them vertically that way to say that one could happen, could be either or, they could happen at the same time, but I haven't solutionized. I really just stated that this is what needs to happen. So if I was designing a shower, I haven't described it as a dial or buttons. I'm now free to think about what a user needs to do and to design the best possible solution for that. Now, story maps tend to grow very quickly. You can see I've already got quite a few things here, and all I've done is walk through the basic few steps of my day. If you're describing the entire scope of a whole website, a whole piece of software, or some kind of service someone experiences, you can imagine how big these things can get. And I'll show you guys some examples in the next section. But for now, we've covered the basic principles that user stories come in different sizes. At the very top level, this is usually what's called the epic. And then within an epic, we can have smaller stories. We can explode it again to have smaller stories. And we can keep going down and down and down as far as is suitable. Running from left to right is time, more or less, the steps a user goes through in doing something. And in the vertical axis are things that can happen in parallel, different options that somebody might choose to go down or different paths. Now, I'll describe in more detail what we do in the world of digital UX in a minute, but you guys are starting to get a feel for this and starting to see how I'm using different colours. So as a designer, you can now step back and look at all the detail of the user experience that somebody has to go through. And as you think about it more and more, you start to uncover more details and more layers. When I first started this, I just thought, oh yeah, I have a shower. When I stop and think about it in more detail, oh, okay, I have to find a towel, I have to turn the water, I have to get the right water temperature. I could then go on and talk about soap and shampoo and drying myself. And you can imagine how big this map can get very quickly. It's a time-consuming exercise, but it pays to be thorough. Doing this doesn't cost you much. It doesn't require a lot of investment in design or prototyping anything. You're merely scoping out everything that needs to happen for a user, and you're thinking through it in a great deal of detail. It's a really worthwhile exercise, and it's one that you can do early on to set your project off in the right direction. Now, so far I've started with an everyday example of getting out of bed and getting started in our morning. You guys are going to be more interested in knowing how I apply this to a piece of service design or UX design. So in my next example, I'm going to move to a digital tool. It's a tool called Realtime Board, which we use in my company here to create a digital version of this. And I'm going to run through a more detailed example of how we might scope out a website we work on. The reason I've started with Postit is I recommend you guys do too. Digital tools are great, they're great for sharing and collaborating with people remotely, but sometimes there's just no substitute for getting a bunch of people in a room together, getting away from any kind of monitors or screens and just doing it simply. Particularly because story maps can get really big, it pays to be able to cover a big wall and everyone to step back and see the entirety of the scope you're working with. Let's talk about what we do in more detail when we work on a digital project.
Okay, so now I'm going to run through an example of how we would use user story mapping when we're designing a digital product. In some of my previous tutorials I showed an example of sketching out a flight booking app. So let's think through an example a bit like that. I'm using a tool called Realtime Board, which is my team's favourite method for using a digital story map. Typically on most of our UX projects we start out with paper, as I've just shown, and then we move to this digital tool so that it's easier to share and update this with our clients and with the development team. But you don't necessarily have to do this digitally. It's really the value in this is in the thinking, it's in working out the user stories, and it's in detailing things. So whether it's paper or digital, it doesn't really matter. It's really the process of thought that we're going through. So in this case, I've already put out a few basic user stories for the. So let's say I'm doing a flight booking website. And I'm going to think through roughly in a linear fashion from left to right the kind of things that a user might need to do. So I know that probably somebody's got to log in first. And I put that as my first high-level story. And then I've added a couple of straightforward details below that. So I'm doing these on digital post-it notes, just like we did on the wall a minute ago. I know somebody might need to enter their username, enter their password. Other high-level stories I might expect as well. Somebody probably wants to find a flight. I think we can be pretty sure about that. Once they've done that, they might well want to book a flight. Perhaps somebody's returning to the site because they've already booked a flight and they want to go and check some details. So that seems a pretty likely thing as well. When we put in these high-level stories, remember we're scoping out the main chunks of functionality and the main jobs that our site does. And then we're trying to add some details below and gradually go down to more and more granular levels of detail until we're describing sort of small features and things like that. But again, remember everything here is written as a user story. It's not a feature, it's not a component. This is one of the classic mistakes that a lot of people make when they're writing these things, is they tend to write features. So they write drop-down menu, or they write save button. Well, actually you need to be describing something somebody does. That drop-down menu is allowing somebody to choose an option. So what are they really doing? Maybe they're choosing their starting airport or something like that. So I'm going to run through and add a few more details on here just to show you guys how this works in a digital context. So if somebody was finding a flight, what might they need to do? Well, chances are they're going to need to describe maybe they'll start with a destination. So I might have somebody who wants to search by destination. I might well want to input my starting airport as well. So let's say What other features might we kind of consider? I might well want to see most popular flights, or perhaps see some cheap deals that have been offered at the minute. So let's put something like that. Review latest deals. Now when I write review, I'm really describing that somebody needs to be able to see something on screen. I find when I make these maps that viewing or seeing something is equally as valid as some activity that might involve clicking a button or a menu. Because if you're a designer, that's telling you that somebody needs to see something on screen. That might help inform how you lay out the information or how you do your visual design, something like that. When booking a flight, there'll be a whole bunch of things that I'll probably want to see. And I can already see that the book a flight section we might be describing a purchase journey here for any of you that have done sort of e-commerce work. So I'm sure there'll be a whole bunch of extra stories here. Booking a flight might mean, well, I might want to know what the price is, so I'm going to say review price. I might want to enter my credit card details, so let's put that down as a story. I might well want to check everything before I click purchase. That's a pretty common step in e-commerce. So I might want to review all booking details. And I probably want to confirm my purchase. Now that's fairly straightforward. There's a basic purchase journey, a linear sort of fashion. And you can imagine there's all sorts of different options under here that I want. So when I'm finding my flight, what else might I need to describe? Well, I might need to pick perhaps I want to choose my seat. There's another option. And you might be hearing a discussion with the product owner or the business analyst or other people on your team, and the user story map can be really useful to start to move things around. So a lot of airlines have you choose the seat a bit later in the journey. That's simply a matter of moving, making room wherever you want to put that story. And you guys are going to have to decide what's right for you. But in a way here, you're laying these out and you're scoping out the design without really having to detail anything yet. So we are completely agnostic of solution here. We haven't defined screens, we haven't defined buttons yet. The value is in going through the thinking exercise. We're thinking about users, what they want to do, what's in their heads, what sort of priority there is to them before we get on into side features. And the two kind of go hand in hand. You'll detail a certain number of these stories, you'll begin sketching some wireframes and screens, then you'll probably return to this map for the next level of detail. And we find over the course of our projects that the two tend to evolve hand in hand. So by the time we get to starting development, we should have a fairly rich, detailed user story map. And additionally, we usually have a clickable prototype or some wireframes that accompany it. And you should be able to follow the two side by side. So the user story map will tell you what somebody needs to do here, so what a user is going to do. The prototype or the wireframes tells you how they do that, what button they click, etc. Now when we're doing these digitally, we tend to refine these over several days, several weeks, several months. It kind of lives for the entire course of the project. But one thing that's quite important in the world of development is setting out priority, because that's communicated into the developer's backlog. Now I mentioned earlier that when things are done in parallel, when a user has a bunch of options of things they might do at the same time, then we stack them vertically. So you can see over here, find a flight. Chances are this is going to be my starting screen. And we can think of several different ways that a user might want to start finding a flight, either searching by destination, by their start point, or maybe they just want to start with, what's a good bargain this month. Now I've stacked them in this order because I've communicated what's the likely value to a user. And in the world of agile development, that equally translates into a developer's backlog. So we tend to have the higher value user stories, or the more critical ones, at the top of a backlog. They will get tackled first in early sprints. And so here, when the design team are starting to move things around and decide what's of most value, that's also going to be translated into development work lately. So let's say I go out and do a bit of user research, or I talk to a business analyst, and I learned that actually reviewing deals is really popular, and most of their customers want to do that. So I'm going to move it up there and stick it up as the top thing there. Now the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to add another layer here. Typically on my maps I tend to draw some lines at some point, and Realtime Board lets me do that as well. You can use some masking tape or something like that if you're doing this in paper. And these lines are going to communicate where we expect we're going to release our software. So when I'm doing them, I tend to label them release 1 or 2. I've got a very small font, so let's just blow that up a bit so it's nice and visible. So I'm going to draw a line here that's release 1. So in the world of agile development, we are scoping out the first release of our software. And what this is saying is, to release the first version of our software, we need to build everything that's required for users to do all of these stories here. And it will help to have the map, be able to see what everyone needs to do as they go across from left to right, and we will decide that these are all the features we need. Now, it might be that we decide some of these stories are lower value, or less people are going to use them, or perhaps we just don't have the time and budget right now to do them. So we're going to move them down below this line. Now this is a common thing, things are going to move around throughout the course of development, but the user story map is there to communicate what's in each release. That's very useful for the dev team. So we typically draw these lines to communicate what's in each release. Now I'm still building the same stuff, my design's probably similar, but I've decided to move 2 user stories down there. Everyone can very clearly see what's in scope for release 1, what's in scope for release 2. Other things that we tend to do is we often augment with groups or sections at the top level. In fact, I think I have some parts up here that I made earlier. So when you get into design and you begin deciding what's on each screen, you might well choose to mark those screens up here with labels. Now these aren't user stories per se, but they are useful markers. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a login screen. I'm going to mark that there. I'm also pretty sure I've got some kind of home page that's where I'm going to start my journey, so I'm going to mark that there. Critically, I have already worked out my user stories. I've done that first rather than letting number of screens or features dictate what I do. And I'm going to put in some lines and some breaks so everyone can clearly see how these user stories are grouped. I'm going to call this my purchase journey. These are quite useful shorthands between the design and the dev team to know which section or which screen you're talking about. And of course, as you can imagine, you've probably got wireframes or prototypes that are going to relate to each of these sections. So when I draw out wireframes for the home page, I know that it's going to do everything here covered in these user stories. I might have a release 1 wireframe, I might do another version that's release 2. You can start to see how user stories are being grouped together. Now sometimes in other projects we find as we're getting into design and we begin making decisions on components and features, sometimes it's useful to add them on here too. Now strictly speaking, that again is an addition to a user story map. It's not a story per se, but I find it useful personally to begin annotating and tagging these things with components, features, notes and things like that. So particularly when you've got a big map that runs for the duration of a project, you can cover it with all manner of annotations, anything that helps your team. So I'm going to show you how I mark on features. Let's say I want to describe the choose my seat feature. Perhaps I've got a graphic of the plane, so that might be one component. I've probably got a seat picking feature. I don't know what that might be. Let's say it was a drop down, so seat picker drop down. I've probably got a confirm button to say I'm happy with my seat choice. Now each of those yellow ones I've put there, notice that they're inside a user story, so I've exploded it down again, and I'm describing particular features that enable that user story. There are no strict set rules for how you do this. The important thing is that you decide user stories and you group and arrange them properly, and then you can choose to annotate that with pages or features, markers of things that you think are very high priority or things that you have questions about for your client. You can kind of add whatever's required to help the team. The key things for me, of of course, are the stories and the markers of what's in each release. And the final part to this, and this is very useful when you do use a digital tool like Realtime Board, is you can sync up this with your backlog. So that's Jira for a lot of people, it might be TFS, depends what you're working on. Realtime Board allows you to add Jira tickets and use them as user stories. So this is where you get a crossover to your dev team. The designers have articulated stories in a shorthand together with the development team, perhaps with the BA. You're going to describe in more detail what's in each of those stories and put it in Jira. Jira is useful for that. It's useful for tracking what's been worked on. The shortcoming Jira has, from my point of view as a designer, is it doesn't allow you that clear overview of all the related stories in a group. So if we're working on the homepage today, it's difficult to see all the stories together and decide how users use those, what's high priority, what's low priority. And that's why having these Jira tickets allows us to put things on the map, move them around, and we begin to integrate the tool that the development team use with the tool that the designers use. I mentioned earlier that these things can get pretty big, and so I'm just going to move across quickly to show you guys an example of a live project for us. Here's a story map that we're working on for a client, and I'm not going to zoom in all the way to show you details, but you can see here blue tags for the section or page, pinks for the epics, oranges for the user stories down below, and in some cases I've added on yellow features for different sections. We've got a line for release 1, a line for release 2, and you can automatically see what scope for the release. You can follow a user's journey from left to right and start to understand what people are doing. And you can see that there are comments and annotations on there because we're working on it. And of course, wireframes and mock-ups over here. We have an interactive prototype. That's something I'll go into more in another talk. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully that's a useful introduction to you guys. User story mapping is a very useful way, I find, of designers and developers communicating together. There's quite a natural fit between research and task mapping and customer journey maps that you might do, and being able to deliver something at the end of your discovery work that the development team can pick up and use as well. More than anything else, it becomes a very useful central reference for an entire team to look at, understand the scope of the product and understand what we've worked on and what we haven't. And critically, that it keeps users in mind. So it can be very easy later in a project to begin talking on features and screens and delivering those. But when your map is represented by user stories, then you're always going to be reminded about real people and what they need to do with your product. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, just let me know.